Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our webinar. I'm Erica Thomas, the head of Newcastle Grammar School, and I'm joined this evening by Alicha Dyer, the head of primary, Mr. Daniel Kozey, our director of sport, and Mr. Alan Parsons, our deputy principal. COVID's impacted on all of our lives, and educators have been under the pump this year. As COVID hit, I remember distinctly finding out at exactly the same time as parents, staff and students what was going to happen the following day or week in terms of restrictions and closures. Usually for us, this was late Sunday and involved contradictory advice between the state and the federal governments. And the school was faced with having to implement things very quickly and communicate any changes to staff and families. And this became one of our first key learnings from COVID. As an independent school, a positive was that we could respond quickly. But we also were at the same time having to work out how we were going to move online and how everybody in our community would manage this. The complexity of the period still sends shivers up my spine, and the solutions were multidimensional. We also found out that we had some gaps, and we had to also think really carefully and quickly on how we were going to solve these. And I remember many times that we came in, we all looked around and we went, okay, that's not working, what do we need to do now? And I think that's something that our organisation has learned, the ability to be agile and to work out where we're not going so well. We also had to think about what the students were facing at home. What was their wellbeing like? We all wanted them to gain from the period, and they did, many of them, in terms of independent learning, executive functioning, self-monitoring. These skills we know are essential, certainly for the period we're in, but also for the future. And I think this is an area that we learned too from COVID. So what we want to talk about tonight is how we build on what we have learned and why we think this will be important beyond a COVID world, whenever that does occur. So I might just hand over, the one thing that I do want to say is that you have a question function at the bottom, the Q&A function. We're going to have a bit of a conversation for the next 20 minutes or so. And at the end of that conversation, we'll give you a bit of time to write your questions, and then we're really happy to answer some of those as part of this evening. So Mr. Parsons, I'm going to hand over to you because you were the one that really put together our parent survey, and you've written an amazing report based on our parent findings. And our parent findings were very, very similar to studies that we're looking at all across Australia and indeed parts of the world. Can you just let us know a little bit more about that?
Yeah, we had some very interesting findings come through the surveys that we did with our parents and the interviews that we were able to hold. What we found was the students who thrived the most online were those who had a sense of autonomy in what they were doing. They experienced some level of mastery, and they felt that there was purpose, engagement in what they were doing, that they were part of something bigger than themselves. They weren't just isolated at home in front of a screen. If we look at that trio of criteria, autonomy, mastery and purpose, it helped these students in their motivation to become engaged and to remain engaged. They felt some control, had a sense of agency. There was a beautiful story of a Year 4 girl who would bring her cat online every morning to her classroom and introduce it to the class. And the teacher who supported and encouraged this, allowing some feeling of being in control. Our older students in the secondary school making an artwork from the materials that they found available to them in the kitchen, again having a sense of autonomy in what they were doing. Or the younger students who are using their toys to investigate mathematics problems. Both examples of a sense of autonomy and a sense of belonging to something bigger than themselves, a sense of purpose. Mastery, students through the primary and secondary schools were able to manage the platforms that were being used to deliver their learning experiences. Parents of primary and secondary students described their growing independence over time online. One mother asked if her daughter needed help photographing and uploading the work for the teacher, to be told, no, Mum, I'm all over it. Having a sense of purpose and relatedness was important for the students who thrived, being engaged and feeling a part of something that was greater than themselves, knowing what they were doing online was relatable to their real-world experiences also. We did find some students struggled. Some students had great difficulty with their self-regulation and were easily distracted. For the secondary students, that took that looked like playing network games, for example. So getting onto games like Fortnite during lessons, where one mother related how her son had 2 screens, and one had the class and one had Fortnite. So managing those distractions were really important. For the older girls and boys alike, having 24/7 access to their mobile phones and the abundance of distractions via constant notifications from friends was something that needed to be looked at. And all parents spoke about the negative impact of missing their friends, reinforcing the centrality of relationships in our lives as children or as adults. That was particularly clear for families that didn't have the luxury or the ability for the family to all be at home during this time. Clearly, one of the most important findings from all of this is that schools, while there may be some space for online learning, we can't go totally online. We are still very much a relational society.
And I think, Alicha, you found that very much, didn't you, with the primary children?
Absolutely. I think one of the main things that we did learn, of course, was never to underestimate the capabilities of our young primary students. Their ability to manage change and be flexible thinkers was pretty impressive, actually, right from the start, because the rollover into online learning happened very quickly. So when you look at a kindergarten student who's all of 5 years of age, has only been at school for a number of weeks, it was actually, I thought, just too much for them to be able to adapt themselves to online learning. But in fact, they did it beautifully. So immediately they were able to navigate their way around Zoom and platforms such as Seesaw. And we felt that because the learning of our students remained differentiated and it had great purpose, the children felt very engaged and enjoyed their learning. So that told us that it wasn't about the technology, it was more about keeping up with the quality of the teaching and learning, and the learners really enjoyed the activities that we were asking them to do. So when we then flip it and we look at the other end of primary school, so years 5 and 6, as they're getting ready to transition into year 7, we can say that we found that there were some students who found online learning very challenging, as they were craving more of that face-to-face relationship with their teacher and their peers. And that's something that we have to consider, I think, moving forward.
And I know that we had a bit of an opportunity to reflect on our program, because something that everyone realised was that our normal activities were changing incredibly during this time.
Yeah, absolutely. It was one of those times, I think, in most of our careers that we actually had time to sit back and think about what we do and how we do it and what we offer. I think things that I learnt from our students was that they were and are ready for a significant change, no matter how old they might be. They adapted so well to the unpredictable journey ahead of them and were seamless in that regard. They're probably more capable than we've actually given them credit for in terms of that adaptability. And I think as a staff and as a group, we need to be as courageous as they are in terms of what we're offering and why we're offering it. The concept of active play also, I think, gave all of our students a glimpse into our own past, and all the mums and dads sitting at home tonight, those hours of free play, rolling, jumping, climbing trees, and doing it all again the next day. It was more of a balance between organised sport and physical activity and the disorganisation of free play and what we can learn from that. I think that leads us into a decent remodel of what we're offering physically here at NGS. That might harness that power of active play, sport and sport excellence, all under the same banner of movement. I think the time did highlight the fact that our students probably need an underlying skill set to make sure they can cope in that changing world long term. And those things might include some things like fundamental movement skills, being generalists versus specialists in certain sports, the flexibility of online options. Our students really enjoyed the fact that they could do some sort of workout throughout the week at some point and weren't tied down to a certain time. They were creative and adaptable in terms of what they were posting and what they were doing together with their families. They showed teamwork, resilience, courage, all those great attributes of physical activity and sport, and it showed that they could self-reflect, and that self-reflecting students lead into self-reflecting adults.
And I think that actually then flowed really nicely into the way that we were thinking about student wellbeing. And many of our primary parents are well aware that we offered movement programs the moment they came back to school, because we felt that being in something that would work for our kids could actually help generate some of the general skills that you're talking about, but also contribute to their well-being.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably a key area. We've always here prided ourselves on thinking about well-being for our students.
Absolutely. I mean, it's always been our number one priority, is the well-being of our students. That's our core business. And during COVID and now moving forward, I think we are focusing more on the well-being of our students because of the year that they have experienced. And so many of them coming back to school, you know, and again then having to re-enter that physical environment has actually been the cause of some anxiety and stress in children. We've seen that. I think though that it's important that we keep monitoring closely these children who are feeling a sense of anxiety as they move through the balance of managing online learning and face-to-face teaching again, because there are still great elements of the online learning platform that we still consider to be very important, and we want to keep that going. But we did feel that coming back to school, we needed to immediately implement a research-based positive education program that would explicitly teach students to develop their own grit and perseverance, their own self-control and character development, and of course emotional intelligence. So through this explicit teaching and the close monitoring of their well-being, we feel we're able to provide them with a real sense of positive purpose as they transition then to Year 7.
And we'll be looking, we look very much at character strengths when they come into Year 7 and move through the secondary school. And our students are very, very familiar with the 24 character strengths that have been identified through positive psychology research. And we know that of those 24 character strengths, we tend to have 5 or 6 of those strengths that we'd call our signature strengths, those strengths that really define who we are. Now, the least common of those signature strengths is self-regulation. And in fact, only 4% of the population have self-regulation as one of their top 5 strengths. The bad news is that for adolescent people, we know that self-regulation is more important than IQ, more significant than IQ as a predictor of their academic success at school. The good news is that self-regulation strategies can be learned. We know that life lessons are transitive. We know that self-regulation skills that students can learn in areas of co-curric. If we look at our musicians, we look at our swimmers, we look at our rowers, we look at our netball players, we look at our artists in residence program, all of those co-curricular programs that are undergoing renewal and redevelopment here are all pathways to developing that really important strength of self-regulation. We know that we can develop students or help students develop their self-regulation by providing them with opportunities to experience mastery and success. We can do that through the application of the Goldilocks principle, where the challenge they face is not too easy and not too hard, but just right, where they can experience a sense of flow when their abilities are just right to meet the challenges that they are given, through differentiating of the curriculum and differentiating of the learning and teaching that's going on, whether that be online or in the physical classroom.
See, I think one of the things you just picked up there, Alan, is that idea of definitely of self-regulation. And we certainly saw that in play during COVID. And we saw students that we didn't think had a lot of self-regulation at times absolutely thrive during this time. And that gets us to this idea about, is learning going to be transformed because of COVID? And I think we could perhaps think of this in many, many different ways. And I know you'll have some ideas, Alicha, so let's start with you.
Okay. Well, I think it's fair to say that currently we're educating our students for an unknown world. So we continually need to be asking ourselves, you know, what are the skills that we need to be teaching our students right from kindergarten, right from that first week of their school journey. So 4 years ago in the primary school, we implemented the inquiry learning framework, which is a process whereby students are at the very centre of their learning. So they create their own questions after being given some prior knowledge around a central idea. They investigate widely and they build new understandings and meanings and knowledge. And the skills that sit alongside the process are vital to their learning in any platform. And they are communication and independence and the power of questioning. That's a really big one. Researching independently and collaborating, being able to be brave and be that risk taker. And of course, after everything that they've learned through a unit of inquiry, how are they actually going to put it in action? So during the online learning, we saw our learners relying on these skills, probably without them even realising it. So even though they've developed these skills over the years in inquiry learning, they're able to then use these transdisciplinary skills across a number of areas. And I think that's actually very powerful. So inquiry learning, of course, it's referred in every curriculum area. And when it's implemented well, it takes on a powerful role and it sparks the curiosity and the wonder of our students. And I think that then is able to then lead our learners into a world of thinking for themselves and being self-regulators.
Yeah.
And that's important.
We actually had a really good question that just came in about self-regulation. And
Okay.
what exactly is it? And can we give an example?
Yeah.
Well, what we actually do know is that students find at times it really hard. If we say that you've got to do some homework, you've got the 20 minutes of maths homework that you've got to do tonight. Say your child is in Year 9 and you've got these 20 minutes that your child needs to do, and the child knows that in the rest of the evening they've got also the history assignment they've got to do, and they've got something else, a longer term assignment that they've got to study for or a test. Self-regulation is the ability for them to say, look, I've got to do this 20 minutes now, and if I'm going to do it, I can sit down and actually concentrate on it. I'm not looking at my phone, I'm not looking at what else I might be doing, and I'm not getting up and going to the fridge while I'm doing my 20 minutes, because that 20 minutes is really important to get started before I then do some of these other things. And what we want to see from primary through to secondary, when we know that only about 4% of the population have this, is what can we do to ensure that kids are gaining this skill? That may never be their strength, but if they can gain a little bit more of this skill, and this is what we saw during the COVID period, and a number of people told us that their child, like never before, without the distractions, was able to self-regulate and get on with their work.
And it could be as simple as a number of very successful students online who decided when it was time to be at their desk, they would put their mobile phone in the kitchen. So not putting it next to them and resisting it, but actually removing the distraction. A great example of self-regulation by those students.
So what we do know, and this is sort of leading further down this path, is that the inquiry model is working really well for primary, and over the last 12 months, and in fact we've picked this up with absolute vigour, we know that we want to move it into that lower secondary area because we think it will develop some of the skills that we're looking for. And we're looking at ways that we might implement that further next year. In addition to that, we know that for upper secondary, this blended model is something that they're probably going to need long term. They're going to need to be able to do some lessons online. We would never have thought of this before COVID. We sort of got that sense that they were going to uni and they'd need to use a number of skills. You know, kids now tell me that they do probably only about 5 hours at times at uni, face to face, and they do everything else online. But we know that the relationship with the teacher is really important. So what we're actually looking at is how do we do some of this? And this might mean that one lesson of the 5 lessons that you have might be done in your own time and might be done online in a particular course. Now, what that might in fact do is help our kids keep this level of independence and really help that relationship with the teacher, but also let them understand that they've got to be responsible for their learning. And so we're looking at a range of things. The other thing in that wider context that's happening, and it's happened before COVID, but it's been accelerated because of COVID. About 70,000 students complete the HSC every year now in New South Wales. And what we actually know is that if they don't complete the HSC, and about 20,000 kids leave school before they do the HSC, and that might sort of shock almost some of our listeners tonight. What we do know is that if they do leave before the HSC, they're now very, very vulnerable. And in fact, studies before this showed that if you were in this category, your job limitations were quite significant. And when I tell you that you were most people in that category go into things like sales assistants, waiters, cashiers. You know exactly where I'm going with this. That's the casual workforce that have lost nearly all of their job. And that's something that I think is worrying a number of people as this changing pathway out of school happen. So we know, number one, they need their HSC. We also know, though, that learning cannot stop anymore at the HSC, and every study has been telling this for years, and the studies that we're reading now coming out of COVID are absolutely saying that you must be a learner and you must be prepared to do this for life. We've got to embed this love of learning in our students. The other thing, of course, that's come out of COVID, that workplaces have changed dramatically. Some of you, of course, are experiencing work from home for the first time. We also know that apprenticeships have dried up, and we know that that too is going to be a change, that people need to be adaptable and flexible and able to meet that. The big unknown, of course, is the university sector, with the international students drying up, restrictions, of course, on travel, and that sector has been very, very important to Australia. We're not sure where that is going to go, but we do know, and the universities are saying this, studies are showing again this, that the cutting of services for domestic students could in fact happen as a result of all of this. Certainly research and development is under threat, and we're really worried about the university sector. My HSC students this year have been absolutely remarkable, and we've been looking at a range of things with those students as the year has progressed, and Alan and I have been involved in mentoring these students and really looking at where those opportunities might come, and they're coming in and they're very aware of this and saying the workplace might be different too. If I do this course, is it likely to lead to a job? And I think we've got to do far more in this area, and this is an area that I think COVID has, as I said, accelerated. We have begun a program to look at what post-school pathways are now going to look like, and that's going to be a big research thing that we do over the next 12 to 24 months. We know that cadetships, we have partnerships with certain industries where you might do part-time university and you might do part-time study. That might be a really good way. So part-time in an industry and part-time study, that might be a really, really good way of negotiating the future for many of our students. In addition to that, the rise of micro-credentialing, and that's something that I know that we've been talking about as part of our co-curricular program, because we think that micro-credentialing is something that they're going to also need. It's a real key for them for the future. So we've got a number of things that are on our agenda. We've learned a lot, in fact, from COVID. So I think if we were to think about what we've really learned, we've learned about learning, we've learned about wellbeing, but if we were going to sum it up, what are some of the things too, Alicha, that you'd like to say? I keep coming to you, don't you?
I've learned a lot about myself in terms of speaking to a camera, that's for sure, and it's a lot trickier than you think. But I think one of the main things we have learnt is that perhaps we should be focusing on our style of communication to families and the wider community, and looking at ways to make it more personal and I guess more engaging. Perhaps it is time, to think about maybe we do away with a newsletter one week or those emails to parents, and actually instead send a personal video message from teachers and students and leaders of the school to our families and wider community. The feedback we received from both primary and secondary parent-teacher interview Zoom sessions was absolutely outstanding, in fact overwhelming, and therefore that's another platform that we should be looking at continuing into the future. But one of the biggest challenges out of all of this is that we need to remain committed, I think, to finding new and exciting ways to keep developing and maintaining our relationships with our families. And that's through the use, I think, of these regular video updates and webinars, and allow parents to be invited into the classrooms to see firsthand what the quality teaching and learning is actually looking like. I think something along those lines would actually be quite powerful and meaningful to families.
Yeah, I think it's been a big learning curve for us, and this is part of it, doing this sort of thing tonight. Alan, what's one of your takeaways from all of this?
I think looking at student wellbeing and where student wellbeing is heading over the next couple of years, I think it's really important that we understand you don't differentiate between academic wellbeing, social wellbeing, or emotional wellbeing. Those things all go hand in hand. So when we're looking at improving student wellbeing, we want to know that we're helping them develop those learner attributes that they'll need moving forward. Alicha and Erica have spoken very eloquently about inquiry learning. We know that one of the issues that our graduates are facing from schools these days is knowing that their workplace will change through their lifetime and that they're most probably going to be studying something quite different or working in a profession quite different to that in which they start. So what can we help them develop while they're here that will allow them to move into that sort of a world? And so I would say two elements that really shone out during online learning, and that is developing curiosity and creativity. Everything else can be outsourced, but you can't outsource curiosity and you can't outsource creativity, and neither can those be automated. So in the world that these students are facing, we want to be able to develop those sorts of characteristics. I want to know that the researchers at the University of Queensland or at Oxford University are developing a vaccine using their curiosity of how that virus works and their creativity in coming up with new ways to attack that virus. Similarly, in real life problems that need solving, we want teachers, mechanics, doctors, architects, plumbers, lawyers, all to be curious in investigating the problems that they're faced with and creative in finding solutions. We're moving very much away from an algorithmic approach to a more heuristic approach of education in line with the way the world is developing.
That's absolutely right. And I think probably one of the biggest things that we've done during COVID is to sit down and reimagine co-curricular and what that could actually do for our students. And you could perhaps we're going to launch this next term to everybody in the whole community. But I thought perhaps a sneak peek about this might be a good idea tonight, given it really fits in with this topic.
Oh, absolutely. I think the reshape of our co-curricular program is about building curiosity. It's about building into what our primary schools have been doing for a number of years and building inquiry-based students and learners. The MyNGS Passport will be student-driven. It will be progressive. It will develop generalists and assist students in their micro-credentialing and making sure that they're ready to see the big wider world once they graduate NGS. All of our students from kindergarten to year 12 will have opportunity to build leadership skills for the future, regardless of whether they are particularly engaging with movement, with the outdoors, whether they're curiously creative or environmental or community focused. I really hope that the program will ignite new and existing passions within our students and our staff and build meaningful experiences with a blend of face-to-face and online learning, as we have learned in the recent months. Our new co-curricular program will be different, it will be challenging, it will be meaningful, and it will prepare all NGS students for an unpredictable future. And I think NGS students are ready for a change and not just a small one.
Yeah. And I think one of the key things that's going to come out of that is that every child will be building a digital portfolio that they can take into the next stage of their life. And I think one of the things we did learn in co-curricular is that while those long-term sort of sports or those long-term commitments that some of our students make to co-curricular, we can also supplement that with some short-term experiences. Absolutely. And that was something that we did trial at one point, and I think that worked really well for us. And so that's what we're looking at. We're going to call them pillars that we think every child will need to take forward with them as they go into their next stage of learning, as it will be, and into their future. And so as Daniel said, things like leadership, we've actually got a section in this called Skills for the Future, and we know that some of the kids are going to really love some of those, as well as all those things that our kids love in their sports. We're just hopeful they get a normal season fairly soon with some of these things. And I've got a key question sitting here which I'll answer in a moment. But if I was going to sum up this, and we're right at the time that we sort of said we'd speak for about half an hour or so, I'd say that what we're looking at, and I hope that our families then really understand why we're doing this, We've had an opportunity to be reflective. We've had an opportunity to look at virtually every part of our organisation as a result of this. And we know that what we want to do then is have, both in the classroom and outside the classroom, some of that blended learning. It's not about technology for technology's sake, it's actually about helping them build the skills that they're going to need, particularly some of those things around self-regulation. And this will allow the students to access curriculum, develop these capacities, and get this sense of flexibility too, I think, in the way that they learn and understand that. The second thing that we definitely know that we want to do is this co-curricular program, because we think we can just do so much with it, and I'm genuinely incredibly excited. And things like that I think will work really well. The next one that we've got to look at is our paths for the future, and I'll answer the micro-credentialing thing there. That might be that you leave school with a certificate in something. You might have a certificate, for example, in first aid, but you also might have a certificate in being a barista that you've learned through our program. You might have a credential in something that is quite different to some of the things that you've got before, but you've had 4 weeks of an experience where you've actually had to market something, or you've learned something. You might have been online and got a little credential around how to market, or how to take something and turn it into an idea to project manage. These things are available online, and that's what we hope our kids are going to be able to take away, partly from this co-curricular experience. We also know in those parts of the future that they're going to look quite different. And getting on top of that is going to be a challenge for every school and for us, but we know we need to make sure each Year 12 student leaves here knowing exactly that they've got a positive future ahead, not one that's been constricted by the changing job market or the university sector that might have shrunk a little bit for them. We also know from all of this, and tonight is one of the best examples, that communication can be done really differently. And as you can sit at home, we can then record this as we're doing. This can be sent out to everybody. But I think both Alicha and I had that moment at the start where we had this, oh my goodness, I don't think I can sit down and do this in front of a camera. Yes. But we're trialling this as a different sort of way of communicating. And in fact, we hope that this might be one of the first webinars that we do. And we will certainly ask if there are other topics that you'd like to give us, that you'd like to hear about. We're going to do that. It's been an amazing year, and I hope you found our first webinar in this format interesting. I've got one question here at the moment, and I'd be really happy to have any other questions come through. We'll give you a few moments and then we'll answer them. And we will be, certainly we hope, finishing up right when we said we would at 6 p.m. tonight. So if you've got any more questions, just start pottering those down. We've got one here, and I can see that this is 3 boys, a passion for sport. Can we make sure that we've got safe bubbles, etc.? I agree with you. We're unlikely to see a vaccine for another year.
Yep.
And I would think your children are in primary, because we couldn't believe the timing, could we?
No.
Mrs. Dyer,
No.
on the athletics carnival.
No, we couldn't write that script.
We couldn't, but I think we are heading to a point where we can do a safe bubble type thing for those sports. And Dan, you actually spent a long time working on that, because we did get the secondary one in, and absolutely. We did it in what we called a safe bubble, and it was just at the right time. But of course we then had those problems in Newcastle itself, and we were told we couldn't do anything outside the school, but we think that's going to relax. So you're absolutely right. Do you want to answer that for a moment?
Oh, sure. I mean, obviously there's a number of factors we need to consider organising any sport, including the off-site venues that we must use. But all of the planning takes into account all the safety, the factors, the risk factors, and we put all of our mitigations in place. And I think for the primary carnival, unfortunately, it was just poor timing with a couple of cases here in Newcastle. And if at any point we're ever unsure, we just won't host anything. It's safest for our families, it's safest for our kids and our staff. And obviously we are committed though to making sure that all the students from kindergarten to 12 are active, because as we spoke about earlier tonight, it does have massive benefits on the wellbeing of our students, and also of our teaching staff and our staff to see those kids in those lights. So anytime we can put something on, we certainly are working on that to do in a safe manner.
Yeah, and I think that's actually one of the key things for you all to know, that one of the things that we have been restrained by is every time something like this happens, and that little resurgence of COVID in New South Wales, it led to further restrictions on schools, and we're not allowed to go outside those guidelines. The moment that we can go outside those guidelines, we'll again look for another opportunity.
Oh, absolutely.
But I don't think there's any way that Mr. Kozey will let the swimming carnivals go next year, and so we'll be working really hard to get those ones through. There's a great question here, Alicha, and we've been doing the Year 5 to 12 assemblies online for a while, but you did a very, very successful primary one just recently. And we've got a question around, what about video assemblies for primary, and are we going to do some?
Yes, absolutely. Yes and yes. We did trial one just a couple of weeks ago, and as Erica mentioned, it was actually quite successful. I have to be completely honest, it actually turned out a lot better than what I had predicted. So we have a model now that we feel comfortable using, and tomorrow morning we will be filming our next assembly for K to 4, and that will be posted on Schoolbox and sent out on Monday. So there's some exciting things happening in tomorrow's assembly, and we will finish the term in week 10 with our third online assembly, and moving forward it will just become part of our week.
And I think we've had very positive feedback about doing the assembly online. For one thing, I can fit all the students in the school into the one assembly at the same time, albeit about 40 different venues, okay, as we do this. But it's something that actually I think no matter what, we all retain part of. It may be some live assemblies, which we hope we can do next year, but it'll also be a mixture of these, I suspect, which might be working really well.
Yeah.
I think there's another one around camp and outdoor education, and I think Year 3 and 4, of course, love their first camp. We know that we wanted to bring camp to Year 7 students, particularly this year. Camp is really important.
It is.
And that outdoor education, we've been working with the providers of those camps to see whether we could redo anything. A number of them have just shut for the rest of the year, and so getting a venue, number one, is actually really tricky at this point. We've still got camps scheduled in late November, and we've moved them now significantly for Year 5, 6 and 7. We're not 100% confident though that they're going to be able to go ahead, but we continue to work that way. But the question is actually around, is there any opportunity in our co-curric to do more of that outdoor education type stuff? And Mr. Kozey smiling.
Somebody wants a spoiler alert.
Yeah, I'm going to give you the spoiler alert.
Okay.
Come on, tell them
the answer is yes. One of the themes and one of the pillars of our new My NGS Passport is outdoor adventure, and that will be based around those outdoor experiences. And again, those credentials that might come within those areas. So keep an eye out for that. There is definitely a large portion of what we're doing around outdoor adventure.
It's exciting.
Yeah, and so I'll spoil it further. Between run clubs and between mountain biking and a few things like that, you might find that this actually begins to work really well for the kids. And Daniel actually said it at the start. What we've learnt during COVID is that active lifestyle particularly and those outdoor activities are so important, and it doesn't have to always be organised sport. But if we can provide some of that during our co-curric program, that'll work really well.
And I'd add there that some of the students who really thrived in the secondary school were those students who were able to organise their own entertainment and activity, whose organised sporting life just fell apart for them. So they jumped on their mountain bike and they went riding through Glenrock and they met up with their mates in that sort of environment. So really, really important for their wellbeing.
And so if we can harness some of that, we think that's really important. So I hope that gives you an insight into some of the ways that we're thinking and some of the challenges certainly that we've found during the period. But I think actually we're genuinely excited about some of the thinking that's come out of it, and we're looking forward to bringing that to you in the future. If you do have any topics you'd like us to do, don't hesitate to email us, and thank you very, very much for joining us tonight. And it's been It's been a rocky road at times, but it's also been a fantastic one, and we thank you for all your support with this, and good night.
Good night.